So what we just talked about is the overall findings of this paper about the Seattle minimum wage, right? And overall, what these authors find is that whereas the New Jersey minimum wage increase appeared to result in increased employment rather than decreased employment, this minimum wage increase resulted in pretty significantly diminished, right? Employment fell by so much, in fact, that total payroll might have decreased, right? So that suggests that labor demand is fairly elastic in Seattle. And so this leads to the question, why are these findings so different from Card and Kruger's findings? Again, it shouldn't be shocking to discover that there's differences in the effect of a minimum wage when we compare two different contexts and two different wage increases, right? This very well could be that these two experiments were just different from each other, but it could also be that these different methodologies led to the results that we find. So the first thing I want to consider is, how do the methodological differences in these two papers affect their findings? So the first thing we might think about that we've talked about a little bit is, maybe it's just that this paper uses this fancy modern method of synthetic controls, and Card and Kruger do an old folky difference in difference, right? It could be that essentially New Jersey and Pennsylvania actually differed from each other in ways that had nothing to do with the minimum wage after that minimum wage increase went into effect. And that likewise, the low wage and high wage establishments in New Jersey differ from each other. Now, on the one hand, this is always something we should think about. On the other hand, the fact that this is such a famous paper and people haven't found compelling evidence of a violation of that assumption yet, maybe makes us a little bit hesitant to throw out Card and Kruger entirely. So in that case, we're really left with two methodological questions, right? The first one is this about a different group of, essentially, is this about Card and Kruger looking just at restaurants and restaurants being unrepresentative? Or is this about Hardiman and her co-authors looking at this wage threshold and having the wage threshold give you inaccurate results? So the first thing I want to think about is the restaurant question, right? And this is something that Hardiman and her co-authors can look at because they can look among low-wage workers at the subset who work in the restaurant sector. Not specifically at fast food, right? And certainly not specifically at Burger King or Roy Rogers, but they can get somewhere into that area. When they do that, what they're going to find is that had they looked at the restaurant sector as a whole and compared it to, the restaurant sector in Seattle compared to the restaurant sector in synthetic Seattle, they would not have come to the conclusions that they came. Right? So if we look at the second kind of set of columns here, where we're looking at the restaurant industry at all wage levels, we're going to see that there really isn't much of a change, not a statistically significant change, at least, in total hours worked at wages below $19 an hour, or in total number of employees earning less in the restaurant sector, and total number of employees in the restaurant sector after the minimum wage goes into effect, either after the $11 an hour minimum wage or the $13 an hour minimum. However, if instead we looked at the restaurant sector at only low-wage workers in the restaurant sector, we would actually find very similar findings for low-wage workers in the restaurant sector as we do for low-wage workers overall, right? So we would see that hours of work and number of jobs start decreasing after the first minimum wage increase. And by the second minimum wage increase, hours of work fall by about 9% and number of jobs fall by about 7%, right about in line with the findings among all industries. If anything, it looks like the restaurant industry has slightly larger decreases in wages and employment than do the rest of low-wage workers. So it doesn't look like the difference between this paper and Card is about focusing on the restaurant sector, because by looking at fast food and looking at fast food franchises that Card and Kruger show almost entirely paid low wages, the best comparison, the closest to replicating Card and Kruger here is this third column. So that leaves us with this other question. Is this about Hardiman and her co-authors being wrong to think that they can look just at workers earning less than $19 an hour? In other words, are they finding that employment falls because they're not taking into account that people are getting raises past $19 an hour? So the way that they're going to try this is they're going to make the total number of jobs or the total number of hours worked at every wage level before and after the minimum wage passed. So as you can see, if we're comparing, so the way that these graphs work is the red lines basically tell you the number of jobs in the year in question, right? So in 2015, the second quarter of 2015, right after the $11 an hour minimum wage passed, the gray is going to show you what the employment distribution looked like in the year before. So the shift from gray to red is going to tell you essentially what happened over the course of that year. So what they're showing you here is, in a year when there was no minimum wage increase, what we're going to see is these sort of slight shifts where the wage distribution goes down a little bit because of the fact that essentially when you adjust for inflation, right, if somebody doesn't get any sort of change in pay, it's going to look from an inflation adjusted perspective like they lost a little bit of money. But you're not really seeing big moves around this threshold of $19 an hour. And when we see what happens after this minimum wage increase goes into effect, this area around $19 an hour looks very, very similar in a randomly chosen year as it does in a year when the minimum wage. In contrast, right, we can see that lots and lots of workers shifted from earning below the new minimum wage to earning exactly at that new minimum wage. So that looks like it's where most of the real action is happening. Another way to look at this is to look at the cumulative distribution. So essentially to say, this is going to tell you how many hours are worked at wages at or below each of these points, right? So at or below $9 an hour, $10 an hour, et cetera. And so what you can see is there's far fewer hours worked at or below the new minimum wage than there were before, but there isn't some big increase in the number of hours worked at or below wages higher than the minimum wage. So it doesn't look like we've kind of pushed people up into earning past the new minimum wage. And it certainly doesn't look like we've got a big shift where we see more and more people earning, instead of earning a little bit below $19 an hour, earning a little bit above $19 an hour, right? We start to see employment increases only kind of past $20 an hour, where it's a little bit less likely that this is a result of the minimum wage. Same thing if we look at the larger minimum wage, right, the increase to $13 an hour, we're going to see that there's this big shift in the hours distribution from, towards the new minimum wage. And of course, now we've got this kind of complicated minimum wage schedule, so towards the 3 new minimum wages. We don't see a lot of action around this $19 an hour threshold. When we look at the cumulative distribution, we see the same thing. We see a reduction in the number of jobs that pay at or below $13 or $14 or $15 an hour. Don't really see an increase in the number of jobs that are paying above $19 an hour. So they're going to say this doesn't really look like we are increasing employment. We're just shifting people from low wage work to high wage work. It really looks like we're just reducing the amount of low wage work that happens. That said, when they use their data to look at people, basically look at jobs and see whether how many people get a raise from one year to another, from a wage below $19 an hour to a wage above $19 an hour, they do see that there's about a 1 percentage point increase in the rate of people doing that after the minimum wage increase. So they say if you think that that might be biasing their results, that would suggest that instead of a 6.9% decrease in hours worked from that $13 an hour minimum wage, maybe it was really a 5.9% decrease. So they argue, yes, this might be a problem, but it's not really a problem that's big enough to explain these very, very large results. Okay, so if we don't think that this is about differences in methodology, right, we might think that this is about differences in context. So we might think that this is essentially about the minimum wage in Seattle being raised past the point where a monopsonistic labor market or something similar is going to give you increases in employment. Maybe the Seattle minimum wage has been raised high enough so that we end up seeing decreases in as we would expect from a neoclassical labor model, right? And this could have happened at a different point in Seattle than it would in a place like New Jersey because of the fact that Seattle is a large, densely populated city. Employers might not have very much market power, so there might not be much monopsony to begin with, and it might be easier for employment to shift from the city out to the suburbs. Okay.